Awesome. Oh. Okay. And just so everyone knows, so if you want to put in the chat where you're from, I'm also going to keep everyone muted.
He's going to be enough for you.
Oh, hi, Robert.
Oh, she's saying hi, Robert.
Oh, hi. I'm just going to mute the microphone if that's okay. I'm going to have everyone muted except for Floyd because he's going to be presenting. And then at the end, we'll have some question and answer time as well. But in case anyone sees, I'm going to be muting microphones as we go through just to make sure that it's a little more streamlined. So awesome. Oh, Mission BC. Very nice, Heidi. And lots of BC on here. That's great. Earlier for you guys than it is for me. So terrific.
Yeah, we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Seems around 38 people.
Yeah.
We had 99 people register.
Wow.
A lot of people are busy and yeah. Really thankful for you guys coming.
Terrific. Okay, so I've put again the link to the Slido in the chat there. And so again, go on there. You can ask questions at any point of the presentation, but you can also upvote other people's questions or upvote your own. And then at the end, when we do a little question and answer, we'll go through and make sure that we're answering the questions, especially those have been particularly upvoted, because we'll know that those are things a lot of people have questions about. So it's 2:05. Floyd, I think I'm going to hand this off to you then.
Okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks again for being here. It's really exciting to share with you some new ideas, actually really old ideas, but perhaps new in a contemporary sense. So we are the team, a new organization that includes volunteers, some part-time, some full-time, called Commonwealth Canada, which is a kind of an alter ego of an organization that most of you know, because that's how you came here, called UBI Works. We've been working on UBI Works for several years, and I've been the founder and principal donor to it from the proceeds of my business. But in the course of these 4 years, I learned a lot about the basic income movement, learned a lot about economics and history, and it came to see the need for another conversation in around the world and in Canada in particular, where we're focused. And on UBI Works' website, our mission statement says, we're for a guaranteed basic income to keep people out of poverty as a first step towards a UBI dividend that gives all Canadians a stake in our future. So, this gentleman on the right who says, I have a job but still need a basic income, whereas the basic income guarantee addresses the immediate consequences of poverty, keeps people out of poverty. We wanted to have a conversation about what's causing that gentleman to be in that situation in the first place. What are the driving economic causes of poverty? To which we find an answer in this concept that we're choosing to call Commonwealth, that many proponents for basic income, including Professor Guy Standing, who is probably the world's foremost proponent on basic income, has designed many trials around the world, says regrettably much of the public debate has been focused on alternative forms of social protection, but he links the authentic justification to being a social dividend, a shared return on the commons, and natural resources that belong to all. So this argument doesn't really hold well it's not part of the Canadian conversation. It's certainly not in political circles, mainstream circles. It's a bit too controversial. So, we see a need to have that conversation but not call it basic income, because that would be distracting. And we've been, we don't want to distract the conversation. We want a guaranteed basic income to come soon. But we feel that we also should have any longstanding real economic reform of the causes of poverty and the causes of middle-class decline need to include the concept of a social dividend, or of commonwealth, as we like to call it. And the two policies can work together. You could have dividends from shared wealth as an underlying cash payment that is underneath the existing social assistance system. In fact, having such dividends makes every other policy cheaper. If we're paying a guaranteed basic income or unemployment or disability on top of an existing cash flow that's based on shared property, it'll just be cheaper. So these things can work together. One you can see as addressing the worst issues, the worst causes of inequality, of poverty. The other, one addresses the worst causes of income inequality. The other is more closely linked to wealth inequality. So today, I want to take 20 minutes to go over some concepts. Obviously we can't go in depth. These are pretty deep concepts. The purpose of the call is to introduce you to the work of these concepts, the work of the org, and find out who's interested, like who's really who agrees with these things, who wants to help walk this new journey with us. I'm also really grateful that there's a number of super experts who've joined us here today. That I encourage you to join us for the Q&A part, because many of you know more than I do, and we can have a good learning together. So I want to keep this to 20 minutes so we can have a lot of the learning happening in the Q&A. So I'm just going to introduce some concepts and talk about just a little bit of these concepts and why they matter. So one is I call the big squeeze. This is a model to understand what's wrong from the perspective of an individual's financial well-being. What's not working right now? We keep hearing in the news that the cost of living is going up, wages aren't going up. What's happening and why? So this diagram sort of summarizes a whole world of research, and from our research, we see that the primary cause of wage stagnation, so being squeezed from wages from the top, is technological job automation. We're seeing stagnant wages. We're seeing researchers have shown that job automation has been a factor for 50 to 70% of the changes in wage structure in the United States. It's causing polarization of the job market, where we're seeing the job market shaped more like an hourglass, where the middle class is shrinking and we're growing at the high income and the low income sides, which means we're moving towards a two-tiered society, which is not healthy. Like that does not lead to good social cohesion or good politics. And technology obviously includes globalization. Like you use the internet to hire people around the world to create global supply chains. We see it as a factor of technology, as well as been linked to the reduction in bargaining power for unions. So by technology, we mean all those things, primarily caused by that. And then at the bottom of people's financial well-being, we see rising cost of living, to which again, there are many factors for why that's happening. But we're going to make the case, and there's content on our website, that, well, the number one cost in anyone's life is housing. So the number one cost that's eating up most people's disposable incomes is housing. And we see the fact that housing and land in particular is an investment asset as the primary cause, and a Commonwealth perspective that includes a land value tax would reduce the factors that are driving that speculative bidding pressure on prices. So we see these as solutions to both. And then even worse, these two aspects that are causing us, that are harming people, are actually interlinked. The more we have wage stagnation, the more income flows to mainly the top 10% and to asset owners, who then buy more assets, which makes life more expensive for everyone else who have to rent and have to deal with the byproducts of that. So in the context of automation of these things, we see that this graph shows what's happening in the United States, where we see the bottom 80% have only 5% of total financial net worth, and the bottom 80%, including all net worth like land and housing, is 11%. So basically nothing. And in Canada, it's not that much far behind. In Canada, 50 people own as much as the bottom 40% of the country. And during the pandemic, Canada's billionaires saw their wealth increase by 50%. Meanwhile, we see wage stagnation for everybody else. So we're in a situation now that has been predicted by many, many economists, including James Mead, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the 1960s, doing work on international trade. And in the 60s, he said the problem of inequality of income is first and foremost rooted in unequal ownership of property. And in the context of automation, he says that the question we should ask ourselves is, what will we do when output per man hour is extremely high, but practically the whole of this output goes to a few property owners, while the mass of workers are relatively or even absolutely worse off than before? Well, I would argue that we're already there. And he says in the context of automation, inequality of property will reach epic proportions. We're in a state now where more of the income is flowing to fewer and fewer owners of property, whether it's real estate property, financial property, intellectual property, and the bottom 80% are left in the dust, where now even working people can't get ahead. It was already the case before the pandemic that 2/3 of people in poverty were working. So, James Mead predicted that real wages would have to go down in an automating economy in order for the economy to work properly. So it could so bad that even the food banks become automated. I mean, we already see that at McDonald's. Like, how far does it have to go? So many leading thinkers in the technology space are saying we have to find a way to ensure that the gains from all this technological development, including artificial intelligence, are shared as broadly as possible, which is many of them are in support of a UBI, and many of them actually in support of UBI from some kind of commonwealth, from shared property, which is the tack that we're taking. So we should be asking ourselves to solve the big squeeze is how do we raise incomes with increased productivity? How do we make sure everyone can share in the benefits of our productivity? And how do we reduce the cost of living? And we want to make the proposal that we should have this concept. We should have a concept of common wealth. Common wealth can exist alongside public and private wealth. As income is increasingly being made without workers, then it's people who own things that are increasingly taking in most of the income. And it's been verified in this country. It's people who own things that have taken the majority of the gain in the last 10, 20 years, not working people. So how do we do that? Because that is in line with our morals. We're not talking about socialism or seizing the means of production. It turns out that free market economists, 100 years of classical economists, have actually noted that there is something that probably should be held in common. There is a class of profits that's considered unearned. And this is a concept that it's not simple to grasp, but I hope after this call, people might want to look it up and understand it more. It's called economic rents. It's a portion of profits that is considered unearned, comes mainly from ownership versus from work or contribution. Included in that is a lot of the value that's created by nature, that comes from the environment, the value of our natural resources, and the value created by the community. We as a society create a lot of the wealth through our purchasing, through the intellectual property assets and the scientific contributions from the past. So commonwealth can work very well in a market system and continue to spur productivity and innovation if we find a way to tax the economic rents as commonwealth. And in doing so, creating commonwealth, we can have a system where the bottom 80% have a share of some kind of asset value that pays dividends. So where does that begin? Well, it begins by looking at nature as a source of commonwealth. And here we look back into our political and philosophical history. Many economists, many thought leaders, including Thomas Paine, one of the founding fathers of the USA, said that natural property that is given to us by the creator, like earth, air, and water, should belong to everyone equally. He believed that we should pay dividends to as a form of social security to the elderly and to the young in an equal measure from the value of nature, as opposed to the value created by people, which should be taxed less and where innovation should accrue to the person who did the work. But this idea that we do have something that should be held in common to benefit everyone is a very old idea. And it goes back even to the foundings of capitalism. I mentioned 100 years of economics thinkers saw that Adam Smith said it's the work of nature, which remains after deducting or compensating for the work of man. And it's usually not less than a fourth or frequently more than a third the value of what's produced is not owed to any worker or capitalist. It's owed to everyone because it's the value contributed by nature. And indeed, researchers have shown that up to 30% of GDP can be attributed to rents from natural resources. That comes out of Australia. In our own work at Commonwealth Canada, our estimate came from resources alone to around 20% of the economy could be considered commonwealth, contributed by nature or society. So that's kind of a philosophical insights that I came to that when I was looking for, well, how do we, because I started from all this from a technology perspective, Andrew Yang and all that was very exciting to me. I'm like, well, how do you actually quantify what is shared human progress? What could benefit everyone? And I realized it's economic rents. And that's a concept that hopefully we can make a little more popular in this country. So what do we advocate for? A national investment fund primarily and a land value tax, both of which can pay all citizens dividends and eliminate income taxes for most people, for those who have the least amount of wealth, the bottom 70% or more. And this fund could be financed by eco taxes, various levies on unearned value from community created wealth, And this could give everyone a financial share of our growing and automating economy. While a land tax in particular can fix a lot of the incentives that are making housing too expensive. So simultaneously taxing what makes life expensive and creates poverty can also create common wealth that actually boosts our incomes and creates more shared prosperity. So these are not new ideas. This concept of an investment fund that buys stocks and bonds can create common wealth that pays dividends. I mean, we already have pension funds. It's really no different. It's just funds that contribute to working age people as well. And around the world, there are already more than 60 sovereign wealth funds that own financial assets around the world. And all of them benefit all people of all ages in their countries through lower taxes, because there's just an alternate source of revenue for the government. Or places like in Alaska, or recently St. Kitts and Nevis is paying dividends from such a fund to all the citizens. And so we could do that too. So how do we put money in such a fund? Many of the ones that have precedence around the world would be rental taxes on non-renewable natural resources, taxes on pollution. So things that harm our commonwealth, that harm our shared prosperity, are a good source for taxing there. Norway and Alaska famously take a large share of the profits from their oil industries, have created these funds. And in doing so, many generations in the future can benefit from the oil extraction of the past. Use fees on public property, if the government is leasing parts of its land or access to public property. Public-private partnership equities. It's been famously said that government socializes the risks while the private sector privatizes the rewards on early stage research on things that become unicorn billion-dollar companies. That could be done differently. Research that is publicly funded could have an equity structure where shares are put into a Commonwealth fund to benefit everyone. Budget surpluses, if we ever have them, every economist says budget surpluses can be a good way to buy shares and bonds for people. Inheritance, estate taxes. If a billionaire dies and 50% of what's acquired could go into the Commonwealth Fund to benefit everybody. But here's where some interesting ideas, and I need to share these ideas, because if the labor market really gets out of control because of massive and rapid automation of jobs, everyone should remember these ideas. There could be levies on monopolies, oligopolies. For instance, Rogers and Bell is an oligopoly. Why is our cell phone bill so high? Well, what if any proven anti-competitive behaving companies had to put shares in a fund that everyone benefits from? So at least everyone benefits from that work, since it doesn't seem that our competition policy can make a dent there. Sam Altman from OpenAI, who's leading the world in artificial intelligence through the launch of ChatGPT, which is an incredible new technology. I advise you all to try it. It's really easy and fun to use. He's really concerned about the rapid automation of jobs. He thinks big companies who make more than $1 billion of revenue a year should pay 2.5% diluted shares into a commons fund that pays everybody. So like a shares tax on the companies that are attaining super wealth and super large companies due to artificial intelligence. And then going back to James Meade in 1965, he was thinking about, well, what happens again if automation takes out jobs so fast and people are left in the dust? He literally said, you could, not in the same words, but he said, print money and buy assets. Like we printed $600 billion in Canada during COVID. It's not an unreasonable idea in the context of that, because he says, if you buy assets that are obviously growing in value and paying out more than the interest payments you're making to yourself, since it's the government making money for the government, it's actually a very solid thing to do, because you're buying assets that are actually paying people and overcoming any potential inflationary pressures that happened as a result. So a public fund is part of the ideas that pays dividends. And second is a land value tax shift and dividend. What do I mean by shift and dividend? The idea is we tax the rental value of land, a very old idea since Adam Smith's times, saying this is the ideal type of tax to boost productivity, to reduce inequality. So there could be a grand bargain. Maybe there's no income tax paid on the first $72,000 of income, which roughly matches to 70% of the population would be free from income tax. And everyone can also get $6,800 a year in land value dividends. or rebates as an equal payment, which helps with affordability, reduces inequality. It effectively means that everyone has a share of this growing asset value. Now, there are many reasons. You could look up land value tax. You'll find like the extraordinary number of reasons why it's a good idea. But I want to hone on just one, because it really affects the Canadian experience, is that so long as land, which is driving home values, is an investment asset, cost of living will always be too high. And a land tax that is at the full rental value of land would completely eliminate the speculation incentive out of the housing market, taking off a huge amount of demand pressure. For example, most people don't know this because our modern media discourse just doesn't talk about it, but there are actually multiple buyers markets, multiple motivations that drive the demand for housing. And the ones that we actually need are people's need to live. People need to live through buying or renting. That drives pricing. Although as people in the business of offering homes to rent, like that also drives pricing. But the other motivation is the desire for wealth creation due to the asset appreciation of houses. And that's what is bidding up pricing unsustainably. It has been historically, forever and ever, it's been like this. And a high land tax could actually stop that finally, so we can keep housing prices low and stable. And why wouldn't anyone want to get on the action? Like during COVID, we saw that homes are earning more for owners than jobs. It's just such it's a better investment asset than stocks and bonds, but it's one that doesn't actually help the economy because nothing's being produced. If you buy and sell a used property, you're not actually helping to spur more construction. So I think it's gotten so bad that non-homeowners, who now own, like investors, own nearly a third of all homes in the major Canadian markets. And we've seen property values, even in small towns, increase by 4 to 6 times from the late 90s. And we all know the Canadian population hasn't grown by 4 to 6 times. So clearly, it's not just the supply arguments and all these arguments you hear in the news that benefit financially a small group of businesses that want to push excess supply. Of course, we need more supply, but no one's talking about demand and the impacts of speculation on the housing market. So a land tax, we argue, would actually keep values of housing permanently lower to the actual need to live, as opposed to people's propensity to bid up higher prices because they expect to make money off of it long term. So stepping back a bit, this idea of commonwealth, like a lot of people have been endorsing it. I mentioned the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, a technical thinker, who says we need to design a system that embraces this high-tech future so that we share more broadly and in our wealth. And where is the value going from all this wealth? It's going to companies and land. So we need to find a way to share that in a way that is a more fair distribution of wealth. And Professor Guy Standing, again, the foremost world expert on basic income, proposes a commons permanent fund, which again comes from levies on commercial intrusions into the commons, meaning the environment, with contributions from a land value tax, eco taxes, taxes on big internet companies. I just find it interesting that both of these men both talk about land as part of the picture. So it really needs to be part of it, or else, our spiraling housing prices will continue. Even if we get an investment fund that shares in value, that will not change the factors that are driving up the cost of living. More people from all over the world have proposed this idea of a fund, citizens' dividend. Again, acknowledges that there is co-created wealth. It should come from natural resources, public investments. That's Mariana Mazzucato, a very famous economist. Karis Roberts from IPPR, that we can all own a portion of the country's wealth. And by holding some wealth in common, the fund would act as a force of economic equality. And since so much of our income is moving towards ownership rather than work, then why not have everyone own a little bit of something? So I think that's how we can solve the big squeeze. We can find a way so that society's progress and technological advance directly benefits everybody, stopping the squeeze from the top, as well as stop the factors driving the cost of living, stop the rent seeking at all levels of the economy that are increasing costs at the bottom. So part of our work at Commonwealth, one of our first projects, because I'm an engineering background, is like, well, how much money we're actually talking about here? Like what is actually possible? And we wanted to replicate work that was done around the world to quantify the rent of the natural resources of those countries. So again, this is only the rent of natural resources. It's not looking at monopoly power or internet or rents and patents and IP. And we found through a 40-page paper you can find on our website that is roughly $420 billion a year is the unearned income, the natural resource wealth of the country. And what could you do with that money? Well, on one side, you could take the Henry George approach, another famous economist on land tax. You could eliminate all income taxes and still have money left for a $5,000 dividend that goes to everybody. Or you could use that to eliminate all taxes, period. That's why it was called the single tax movement. On the other extreme, you have inspired by Thomas Paine, who's inspired the basic income movement around the world, and just have it go to everyone equally and still maintain the income tax structure that we have, which that could pay for $16,000 a year. Or something in the middle, which could be a grand bargain. Now, these numbers are bigger than what I mentioned on the land tax slide, because these are all resources, not land only. So this is what could be possible. Imagine such a society. I would argue that some method that includes eliminating income tax for at least the bottom half or large amount is important as we move towards a more automated future, because a lot of the nature of work is changing. A lot of work that we will be doing is non-market work. So it's important to note that if there is a tax shift, it's not that people don't pay income tax. It's that your rent is how you pay income tax. The portion of rent that tenants already pay would not change, but a portion of that it would be taxed. So literally living is how you pay tax, and people who are renting would be the best off here because they would have a tax shift in dividend, and it wouldn't cost them any more than before. So the lowest income people, the most vulnerable people, would come out really far ahead, even in a tax shift plan. So that would be potentially a political bargain that could get the middle class on board. So that's why we include it as an option and promote it on our website. It's not only about the maximum size of dividend, because there are political realities that we have to face. So that said, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Ben Earle, who led the research effort on our resource rents paper.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Floyd. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to just give a very brief overview of what we did in the rents paper. The numbers that Floyd just shared with you come directly out of that, and I encourage you. I think Chelsea's put the link to that work in the chat. This paper was our attempt when we started having these conversations just over a year ago. We had that question that Floyd alluded to: what actually could be possible in the Canadian context around rents, and what rents could be available. And we realized, looking at work from other jurisdictions, Prosper Australia, looking at the total resource rents in Australia, and the Vermont Green Tax Initiative out of the University of Vermont, who did similar work for that state, we realized that we didn't really have a similar understanding in Canada, at least in an aggregated way. So we undertook, starting in about January of last year, to start to assess the potential rent values and economic rent in Canada. We started with the broad picture of what rents could be gathered from multiple sectors and resources, and we honed in on the natural commonwealth. We do acknowledge, and I think Floyd did allude to this, that there are rents to be gathered from technological monopolies and other types of resources, especially and on social resources. But this paper really honed in on sort of the natural commonwealth that we have in Canada, with land being the primary one, and then going through other natural resources sectors, minerals and energy and oil, as well as forestry and fisheries, but also talking about our air resources and our water resources, and what the use of those it could look like, and what people should potentially, and companies and others should pay potentially to use those resources as they generate wealth. We wanted to show the potential value of this commonwealth by examining what rent could be captured from these resources. It is important because we wanted to provide a practical demonstration of the extent of wealth that exists in Canada, but also the extent of economic rent that is currently in these sectors, and potentially the rent that could be captured for collective investment, and whether it's a wealth fund or other tax benefits or other types of investments into Canada. These are all resources that belong to us collectively. in Canada. And we have a rich natural resources in our country, and we generate a lot of wealth off of these resources. None of this was done with the idea that we would eliminate the ability of anyone who's productive on this land to also generate profit. Floyd showed a Venn diagram that showed that personal wealth growth is also part of what we're talking about. Just acknowledging that there's also a commonwealth that could be collected, and sometimes this wealth is going to private interests when it could be captured for public benefit. We just wanted to really build this idea that people who are benefiting from ownership, generating unearned income, there is an idea that they should pay fair compensation to the owners of those resources. And the owners are all of us, especially when it comes to natural resources. And this is not a new concept in Canada or elsewhere. There are already royalty and rent regimes that exist, especially in the energy sector, the mineral and forestry sectors. There's very strong histories of creating stumpage rates, for example, in forestry, and mineral and resource and mining companies paying rents and royalties for the extraction of resources on land in Canada and in mines and other resources in Canada. So none of this is new in the Canadian context. What we simply were trying to do with this paper is understand what additional rent could be collected if we made adjustments to many existing policies or looked at these assets in different ways. So that's what we did. I encourage you to please go take a look at the paper. And I know it's been linked. If you have questions, we can answer some of them later here, but also we're happy to have discussion further when you've had a chance to really dive into the paper. I will now pass it back to Floyd to talk about sort of what's next.
Yeah, so I promised this would be quick. So we're at 30 minutes in. This is the last slides. So what do we want to do looking ahead? Well, we want to make sure this ideas are in the marketplace of ideas in Canada. There's a lot of ideas, and no one's talking about land value taxes. No one's talking about Commonwealth, the idea of rebating part of the value of our society's progress. It's just completely absent. So this is the beginning of a very long road in these directions. And so we want to build a network to amplify these ideas through, writing, speaking, and campaigning, produce engaging content. There's a lack of good starter content, especially for the younger generation. Support research on rents and related topics. There's a lot of research on rents internationally, but very little in Canada. So we hope to inspire maybe an academic institution to pick it up, because there are others around the world that do that. And present versions of this talk, longer versions, in forums around the country. I'll be doing a longer version that I'll invite you all to help with at some point, and start building community. So that's what we're doing, and I'd like to thank you for coming. I think the best part of the call is just coming up. It's the Q&A. I mentioned we have some special guest experts here that know a lot more about these things than I do, and I think we can have a lively conversation. Chelsea's going to put in a link to our survey. The survey is not just a survey of the call. It's a chance to let us know how you'd like to be involved, if these ideas were compelling to you. So please take a minute. You can fill it out while we're doing the Q&A. We have another 25 minutes to do that. And if not, we'll send you a link after the call. So thank you for coming. And it's been a great show up. So let's go to Q&A. You can, again, if you're not in, you can visit slido.com, type in this code, see the questions, add more questions. And we have a good amount of time to discuss the issues. And I invite you, some of the experts in the room, to also weigh in. Frank, yeah, a lot of people here, Martin, Audrey. Love to hear from you as well on these topics.
I think our most upvoted question is also from Frank, which helps because he might have a good answer to it as well. Would an LVT help address climate change?
Right. So Frank, I'd love to hear your answer on this.
All right. Well, there's a number of reasons. It's very comprehensive, but the very easy one is a carbon tax, because when you spew carbon through how you heat your house, or how your vehicle moves, or your airplane, you should compensate the community for the privilege of polluting. Polluting is a privilege. It's not a right, and a carbon tax recognizes that. And so it requires people who do pollute to compensate the rest of us because it's despoiling the earth, despoiling the commons by polluting the air. So we do have a carbon tax in Ontario, or at least we have a carbon fee and dividend structure, which is a good start. And there are carbon taxes in many countries now. And so that's one clear example of how economic rent helps finance governments. And that could also include a UBI. Another way, there's very complicated, as soon as you start putting a fee on land, first of all, you don't tax land because land doesn't belong, it belongs to all of us. So you are compensating the community for monopolizing a section of land. I have a house here where I'm living in, and I have a lot, and the land this house is on, I have monopoly over that. And if anyone steps on this land against my will, the cops will come and take them off. So I have to compensate the community for the privilege of owning land. And when I own land, it keeps everyone else off of it. And so if I use this land wisely, then it benefits the whole community. But if I have a lot of underused land, then everyone else has to drive past my land to get to theirs, and so you have sprawl, and you have pollution of wasted time in traffic, etc. So a land value tax will really make the use of land more efficient, and it'll shrink the size of our cities and towns and leave a lot of land to nature. And for carbon sequestration, et cetera. There's a very complicated side to it. I wrote something recently on this on the Robert Schockenbach website, and I can put a link in the chat about that.
Amazing, thank you. Any other experts want to weigh in?
Specifically on, the climate change question.
Yeah. And on our website,
Question.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Mr. DeJong.
Would you please put it in the Slido, or we can put it in for you if you need, and we'll get to that in order. Or
Give it a shot. I think one of the problems I'm going to have is I'm not a computer guy like maybe most of you are.
okay.
Okay, if you can put it in the chat, I can add it to the Slido for you. I'll send you a message.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Just
no
want to go in
worries.
order of voting. So yeah, another thing on climate change. There's a writer, Peter Barnes, that I really like, who talks about basically Commonwealth under a different name. Talks about universal property. There's a new book called Ours, and he's fond of saying that the environment is not seen by the market. It's not even recognized by economists. It's like these are all called externalities. So if we put a price on nature, nature can interact with markets, and markets can properly conserve nature, because nature should be expensive. And,
To expand on that a little bit, Floyd, there's a theory here which Floyd talked about, reducing income taxes, and the basic meme that I like is that all taxes should be on the use and abuse of nature. There shouldn't be any taxes on people. There shouldn't be taxes on businesses. There shouldn't be taxes on sales. So we're talking about a tax shift, a revenue neutral tax shift onto nature. And whenever there's a tax on something, whether it's sugar, cigarettes, or alcohol, people use less of it. So that's the whole nation again of right pricing land, right pricing resources, right pricing pollution, because people will use less of something if there's tax on it, and they will use more of something where there's no tax. So if you have a business and and as soon as you hire people, you're incurring all these collateral costs of hiring someone, that discourages you from from creating employment, which is a perverse, what is called the deadweight tax. So we should untax people and uptax nature.
there you had it. That is the core philosophy of Georgism, Henry George, and we also have Ed Dodson in the room, who's a leader in that movement. So the next question is, how would this interact with other social services? So I'll just bring the slide back up again. There's no reason that the existing entire system could be built on top of dividends from shared wealth. But I said at that time that it would make everything else cheaper. If someone's receiving, if a guaranteed basic income is set at, say, $20,000 a year, but people are already getting $10,000 in a Commonwealth dividend, then the government only needs to come up with the balance of $10,000 for those who are in poverty to address complete poverty. So it works completely seamlessly. I mean, a guaranteed basic income is already supposed to be a top up on top of existing incomes. So just like we have the GIS for OAS GIS for Siemens, which is a top up over CPP and other sources of income. Other existing programs could already work with dividend income. There's nothing really new or special about dividend income and how it interacts with the social assistance system. It'll just make everything else cheaper. And in some cases, could achieve replacements, because a lot of existing payment systems would be a lot less than a Commonwealth dividend. So we would need some of those cash-based programs specifically. And yeah, it would be for everyone, because the point we're taking is that this is a property right. This is a key difference between the guaranteed basic income, which is a redistribution to address poverty, which we dearly need, or something that's a property right, where we have it because of a co-ownership of something. That's why we like to call them dividends, because it's shares of an asset. And it shouldn't just be a few people that make asset income. Why not have everyone make some asset income? Next question, does LVT help reduce the housing crisis? I certainly have opinions on that. Any experts in the room? Martin, Ed, want to chime in?
I'll just say one basic idea is that as soon as you right price land, then it'll incent individuals and businesses to build more housing units on less land, because land value taxation does not, it untaxes buildings. Presently, the municipal tax is a combination of building and land, and a land value tax would ignore the buildings, ignore the improvements, as they're called. And so that would automatically incent a lot more housing on the same amount of land, reducing sprawl and providing all different kinds of houses. It also, like you said earlier, Lloyd, it eliminates speculation. One of the big problems now, land is a speculative option for people, and LVT removes the speculation from land and forces people with money to put their money into the productive economy and not into the speculative economy.
Ed,
Yeah.
please.
Floyd, I guess what I add is a concern about the fact that it's so difficult to get this measure passed in a legislature, that we have an immediate housing crisis, a housing affordability crisis. And so while I agree with everything that Frank has said and you have said, I think we need a concerted effort to get public money placed into the construction of permanently affordable housing as a transitional interim solution. There's no way around it that I can see, unless by some miracle we can get legislators to understand that how the government has been raising its revenue for so long has been counterproductive. Our colleague in the United Kingdom, Fred Harrison, has made a really good case that the enemy of this just tax idea is the middle class. That we as homeowners, most of us, look to the value in our residential property for our net worth, for our primary source of retirement, because the rest of the economy has made it very difficult for us to save for retirement. And so there's this vested interest that people have in the equity they have in the land under their residential property and in the value of their property through amortization and their mortgage loan. So the politics are what is really difficult to get people, average people like us who don't really think about the fact that their adult children can no longer live in their town because property is so expensive. And so we see, all of the issues with sprawling development as developers must go further and further away from the urban core and from employment centers to find land that's sufficiently inexpensive to build housing that people can afford. And the next thing you know, we have 40-mile traffic jams of people going in all directions to try to get from home to work. So we have serious systemic issues, and we have to work for the kind of solutions that you've identified for sure. But it's my view that we need a national program in Canada and the United States and everywhere to really begin to allocate funds for the construction of permanently affordable housing as an interim solution. I don't know if Frank concurs with me or not.
Well, what you were maybe alluding to is a land trust. There are a number of jurisdictions that the government owns the land, but the people own their building. And that way you can decommodify land. It's land value taxation basically decommodifies land, but you can also do it by fiat, by creating land trusts.
And nothing against land trusts, you know, if you can aggregate sufficient land to provide more than, you know, a handful of housing units. That's, again, I think these are the practical challenges we have of reaching scale, where if you have, you know, if you have thousands and thousands of people who are living marginally or are homeless or living bundled up in a house with 4 family units, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we could get land value taxation approved and implemented and start to make the tax shift, we could see that there would be revenue generated from that could be allocated for the creation of land trusts and the construction of, let's say, limited equity cooperatives, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Ed. Matt, you had your hand up. Do you want to add to this, or do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to weigh in another aspect that often gets overlooked is zoning, and how zoning is intertwined with property taxation and land value tax. So even if you implemented a full land value tax system, you still have to consider the regulatory measures that decide what you could and couldn't build on the land. And so, you know, that would dictate part of the ad valorem value as well. So, you know, when municipal governments are looking at this, upzoning and downzoning is a way to create value or expropriate value that then gets recaptured by land value tax. So, you know, that whole aspect, and state governments and provincial governments are starting, it's generally a local thing, and I only know this because I'm a mayor, but state governments and provincial governments are starting to weigh in on it now and establish zoning minimums or other standards, because local governments are too NIMBYistic because they're small and more easily hijacked by special interests. So that's another key part of the conversation that's a driver of those costs and cost to people generally that often gets overlooked. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion. Other than that, I agree with what everybody said.
Absolutely. And
I'd like to add one thing to what Matt just said, if I could, and that is what we see consistently is when a community improves higher density zoning, land prices immediately escalate to accommodate the number of additional units that can be constructed. So you basically hope that you're going to get a lower cost per unit, but because of the ability of landowners to dramatically increase their asking price for the developer, it ends up that the condominium unit in the high-rise building costs as much to purchase as a single family detached property did before the zoning was changed.
Yeah, I want one last piece and go to other questions. More supply is not the only answer to housing affordability. I mean, we've seen research showing that a new skyrise only brings rent costs down by like 0.5% or 1% in the neighborhood around it. We have there's areas around the world where the population is declining and housing prices are still going up. So I think a bigger culprit here is the impact of land as an asset class that generates wealth, and we better generate wealth through our labor than through just sitting in housing and having it go up for us and do, you know, because that creates loops that are self-fulfilling and will keep driving prices up even if we double supply. It's just a matter of time until housing gets too expensive again because of the underlying incentives in the market, and that's what I think an LVT addresses.
Floyd, Robert Tilden has a question. He's waiting.
Right. Okay, Robert, you had your question earlier, so yeah, please go ahead.
What would happen if we locked in the taxes, just say temporarily where we are right now, and allowed me as a homeowner to increase the density of my property appropriately? In other words, no slum landlord stuff. And my then land taxes stayed the same in perpetuity because I have allowed more people on my property And then those landowners that are sharing my land with me, share the taxes with me. Would that be a possible way to eliminate lack of housing? Because it seems to me it would, because I could throw in 2 or 3 containers made for homes, hook it up to the septic system, and away we go. And my taxes won't go up because I've put more people on my property. My taxes would be split between the 2 or 3 containers and my house. And I just use containers as a way of reference. It could be adding to my house and turning it into a condo. You know what I mean? It's just as a reference point.
I'd say, Robert,
Alleviate things.
I'd say good thinking, Robert. You're onto something there. But you realize that a land value tax untaxes the improvements. So any landowner can add construction to their property without the land tax going up, because the land tax, sort of contrary to what Ed was saying, the land tax is not determined by the amount of units on the property. If land value taxation is implemented, because the land tax is determined by the optimal use, the highest and best use of every property, regardless of whether it's vacant or whether it's used to its highest and best use. It doesn't change the land value tax.
So I made a mistake.
And Frank, I'd like to, correct the misinterpretation of what I was saying. I'm talking about how the market operates absent land value taxation.
I realize.
Okay.
When I was saying that, I did recognize that I was not. I was criticizing you unjustly, because I remembered that you said that, Ed, and you're correct.
If we could get, anything close to 50% of the rental value of land collected, we would start to see a dramatic drop in the price of land, because owners of vacant property and underutilized property would now think about how they could bring their property to its highest best use and begin to construct new buildings, tear down old ones, and we'd start to see an increase in the supply of capital, of buildings that could be used for residence and commercial property, et cetera. And so in that sense, when the supply demand ratio changes, you're going to have a reduction in the cost to people who are going to use property.
So just back on the question about the environment, I want to read out a chat by Audrey in the chat. Thank you, Audrey, an economist I respect a lot, saying regards to the environment, the other component of the tax shift in support of ecosystem preservation and efficient use of natural resources is that it sets a new level at which endeavors are profitable, making more wasteful uses of these natural resources too expensive for the benefits they confer. It can make it too costly for billionaires to use private jets. It would incentivize alternative uses of transportation, including the profitability equation in the externalities that are typically ignored and socialized. So that's a key answer, is that, again, nature, the environment is not considered in our economics. They're externalities. So such a system would make the market preserve nature more than it does. And so another question about, would this encourage or the exploitation of nature? I would argue that it wouldn't, because it may sound intuitive that if we're all profiting off nature, then hey, we want more degradation, but we're also paying for that. It's expensive, and I don't think they look at all the opposition to the carbon tax, for instance. I don't think the carbon rebate alone is enough of a reason to argue for boosting the carbon tax. So that's just politics.
Well, Floyd, you're correct. The present tax structure is a leftover from the era when nature was everywhere and people were scarce, because there was always full employment, because we were engaged in the industrialization of the world. And so we still have this notion that we should be taxing people and businesses and not taxing nature. But we have to catch up with the new reality that we should continue to be taxing the component of production that's in least supply, and that is now nature. people are plentiful. We shouldn't be taxing people, but we should be taxing nature because it's in dire straits. It's being polluted and habitat destruction, etc. So we have to. Our tax structure has to catch up with the new reality. We are no longer in the 19th or 18th century.
That's right. So we're nearing the end. I can talk about the stuff all day. So maybe we'll have an official ending, and then whoever wants to stay and keep talking, because there's a lot of super avid people interested in these topics here. Let's just keep chatting. But I encourage you again to please fill out the survey form so we know if you want to help, be part of this. We want to amplify your work. Maybe have people on social media amplifying each other's work, help with op-eds, and bring some attention to these things. So the survey lets you opt in for how you want to help if you're interested in these topics. So that said, maybe that's the official close, but let's go to Q&A, and people feel free to drop off whenever you like.
Send the surveys to everybody's email, right off the top.
We will do that.
I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if anyone has particular questions that I can respond to.
Yes,
So
please.